Chapter 2. I have been working with people at the end of life since the death of my partner Steve in 2007. I did not choose this work, it chose me, and I could not have seen it coming. It has been a long, hard path. Not much of it has been easy, but it has been startlingly wonderful. Steve left me distraught when he died, but he also left me a gift. He gave me this work to do, and as the fog of grief lifted, I began to see more clearly that his death had given me a purpose. My mother was so beautiful, so kind, so wonderful, and so afraid. She had longed for much more than her parents and her childhood could provide. She felt unseen, unheard, and different. Somehow she had found and married my father and begun a life away from all that had held her back while growing up. And now she had the daughter that she had longed for, who believed that she was a fairy. We loved each other dearly, but from the start she could not understand why I was the way I was. I could not understand her rules for me. They made me rebel, and it felt as if my whole self was wrong. I wanted glitter and colour and magic. My mother wanted smart clothes in quality fabric, a tennis club, and for me to say the right things. When one of my mother's smart friends asked me what newspapers I read when I was 10, I replied, "The Sun," and watched in amazement at my mother's flustered explanation that I meant the Times. I had very little idea what a newspaper was. I had seen somebody reading the Sun and I had liked the big letters. Being a fairy at primary school gave me something special to talk about, though I was an easy target for rival fairies. In the playground, a group of girls gathered around me and told me that only those born in 1959 or 1961 could be fairies. I was born in 1960. You can, they told me, be a fairy if you go and talk to the Fairy Queen and ask her permission. And Esmeralda, the Fairy Queen, lived in a tree outside the sports hut. And so I spent all my break times talking to a tree in the hopes that I was really a fairy. The other girls kept checking up on me and laughed when I said that no Fairy Queen had appeared. It was a dreadful time, and my break time spent speaking to the tree outside the sports hut made me more and more miserable. In the end, my mother took me aside and gently asked me what was upsetting me. I told her, naming the girls who were the real fairies, and cried and cried. Mother hugged me, soothed me, and told me not to worry. I remember being very relieved when the rival fairies found me the next day on my way to speak to the tree and told me that I was a fairy after all. They'd had a word with the tree and it was all settled. In fact, all the rival fairies were very nice to me from then on, and I assumed it was because of my superior fairy qualities. Of course, Mother had gone to the school to sort out the fairy problem with the Catholic nuns who taught us, and Mother won. I was the chief fairy once more. I was both free-spirited and a willful rebel against my mother's fearful rules, intended to protect me from criticism and judgment. The thing was, I thought my mother was wrong. I grew up trying to be two people and being neither of them very well. Over the years, I became an exaggerated version of who I wanted to be when away from home, and a bad version of what I thought my family wanted when at home. Nothing worked. In my teenage years, I chose wildness, disorder, chaos, creativity, and art. I chose mad friends, dressed like a punk, sought danger, and danced to reggae. But I painted all the time. Colour, people, myself, my friends, my surroundings. I found comfort and meaning in creativity, and while at university in the early 1980s, I dyed my dark hair blonde and then turquoise and finally bright pink. It went down well in Aberdeen in Scotland then, where most people thought I was an alien. In London, in my late 20s, much to my astonishment, I fell pregnant with my first child. When, shaking with nerves, I told my mother, she put her arms around me and told me all would be well. I was 29. We did not get on, but I needed her support. With my children, she never let me down. She was wonderful. I ended up married and 2 more children followed. My husband and I had a difficult time together, and one evening, after he had been drinking heavily as usual, I threw him out of the house. My children were tiny, and I knew I had crossed the barrier at last. I divorced him and began life as a single mother. I didn't like my husband. I never really had. I married him because I thought I had to after my daughter was born, and I expect he felt the same. He was Russian, exotic, beautiful and clever, but very damaged and unstable from his life in the Soviet Union. I was his second wife. He had been both married and divorced by the time he was in his early 20s. Despite being younger than me, he had already had a full and disturbing life, and I must have seemed safe and kind. Our children are also exotic, beautiful and clever, and I am grateful to him for them, very grateful. During this marriage, I was so utterly unhappy that I chose to eat and eat until I could eat no more. I gained 5 stone in weight, which eventually I lost, but the experience of being so overweight mirrored the awfulness I felt in my marriage. My husband was as miserable with me as I was with him, and I am glad he is married again for the 3rd time and has remained married. I didn't know what being in love was until I held each of my new, large, pink, half-Russian babies in my arms and marvelled. All of my babies were between 9 and 11 pounds at birth, very unforgettable. Mother burst out laughing when she held her first granddaughter just minutes after she was born. "She's just like Khrushchev," she said, and we all agreed. Nikita Khrushchev had been the premier of the Soviet Union from 1953 to 1964, and as bald, pink, smooth and round as the little squashed half-Russian baby girl that I had just given birth to. She is very beautiful now, very like her grandmother. She didn't stay like Khrushchev for long. When, after 10 years of raising my 3 children alone, I met Steve, it was as if I had not been breathing properly until that moment. I was weary, poor, lost and lonely. Whatever half-life I was living was all I could expect until the end. Whatever half-formed person I was now would never change. But I always painted. Even in the darkest days I painted, but I could not understand who or what I was. The fairy was long ago lost in the struggle to keep going. And then I met Steve. I knew he was for me, I just knew. And when I first met him, I cried because I knew. He, in his way, felt the same about me. The light he brought into my life was both terrifying and wonderful. All that I had believed about myself, I had to unbelieve. Someone could love me. Someone could see me. Steve died of cancer of the liver quickly and without respite 18 months after we had met. There is a before Steve and an after. Before, I thought that in the end love conquered all, and that God in his heaven was, generally, on my side. I had been through hard times, but there was always some way to find comfort. I had my children. I knew my family would help if I needed it. I could paint, and friends in my street always looked out for me. And though I had been raised a Catholic and no longer connected with that faith, I had a respect for God and thought that actually, if there was a God, I was probably on the okay list. God would look out for me and all would somehow be well. For a long while after Steve died, I saw the world as threatening and that we little people on this earth were powerless. I saw God now as a cruel trick created by well-meaning people to distract us from the pain of living. If I had been on the okay list, I was now either off it or it had never existed at all. God had done something so terrible by taking Steve just as we had found each other for no reason at all. I was done with him. He could go take a running jump. During this dark time of grief, I painted Steve over and over again in an effort to understand what was happening. I painted him before he died, both in his hospital bed and later in the hospice. The morning he died, I painted him too. The nurse who took me to sit with his body asked if I wanted a photo taken with him, laid out and at peace with a rose on his pillow. I regret saying no now. At that time, the idea was too much for me. I took photos of him though, and I'm glad I did that. I documented his decline, fascinated that somebody could fold up simply and die like this, even as his mind wandered and his breathing began to change. I was overcome with admiration for the way he was doing this dying. A tall, healthy man, he had changed as the cancer had advanced to become a shadow of himself, disconnecting from the world, fading away, and yet still alive and still my Steve. His soul was the same. It was still there, shining despite his body fading away. I needed to paint him to try and understand what was happening, to remind myself of this final journey, and to mark every moment his poor body changed. It was a way of holding on to him, as if understanding the process could somehow save us both. And all the time he was ill, all the time his body was dying, he, Steve, was still alive. He was alive. Until he was dead, he was still alive and breathing. For 2 years after his death, I worked in my studio on painting after painting of Steve, using photographs that I had taken of him during his dying. Steve knew, agreed, and approved of what I was doing, and had kept some of the smaller images with him in his hospital room. I wrote about him, I wrote about me, I wrote on the paintings themselves. By 2009, I had enough of a collection of images and words, and I put on an exhibition in my house, calling it A Graceful Death. The subject matter was so bizarre that I did not expect anyone to come, but they did come. They came, and none of them said to me, "Oh, Antonia, how you have suffered." Instead, they told me that the paintings reminded them of their own story, and that they too had lost someone, and they began to tell their story. The images of and words about Steve applied to so many other people that I began to understand 2 things. First, I am not the only person to have been bereaved, and second, everyone, everywhere, has a story of loss to tell and nowhere to tell it. The exhibition began to travel around the country and to grow. I worked with other people to join the A Graceful Death exhibition, painting them before they died and asking them 2 questions. The first, who are you? The second, what do you want to say? I spent 8 years painting people for the A Graceful Death exhibition, meeting families, getting to know the people who I am painting, interviewing the dying, and working out with them how I was going to present them in their portrait. Sometimes time was short and we had to use that time well. Sometimes the painting was completed after their death and the families approved it for the exhibition. All the sitters in the exhibition were wonderful, knowing that each was facing their own death and each wanting to help other people to understand and be prepared for when their own time comes. There was a great deal of peace and wisdom in many of my Graceful Death sitters. There was also pain, fear, struggle and sorrow, and that was part of the process. One of the ladies I painted cried after one of our sessions so loudly, so painfully that her husband ran in to stop her. "Leave me," she said. "I want to cry and I need to shout. I need to do this. You must let me cry." In the beginning, at each new exhibition, there was another painting and interview. And at each exhibition, people came from all walks of life and were moved, inspired, and astonished at how simple, how ordinary, how uncomplicated all the people in the portraits were. After each exhibition, then and now, the paintings come back to my studio, are wrapped in fabric and string like so many Christmas presents, and placed along the studio wall until the next time that they are needed. There are now over 55 paintings and portraits, and the A Graceful Death exhibition is as big as it needs to be. I no longer paint for it. The exhibition has grown to include books, music, poetry, and prose sent in by the members of the public. There are films and a prayer bowl in which to place stones to remember the dead in the blessed water that it contains. Of course, my mother is present in the A Graceful Death exhibition now, both in a painting and in a short film describing her final days. My youngest brother is also a part of the A Graceful Death exhibition. During his cancer journey, I asked him if he wanted to be painted and interviewed. He agreed to it, but dreaded the interview. "I didn't want to do it," he said after it was completed and printed up. "It made me feel angry. But now it's done, I feel lighter and surprised at how much I needed to talk." My brother Dominic was a Catholic priest, a very busy and private man, a holy and good man. We conducted his interview in his office in the priest's house next to his church in Dorking, a difficult interview for both of us. He saw his illness as something to be understood and analysed medically. His feelings and fear came through as anger. And he could be very angry. Later, as his illness progressed and he understood this, and the wisdom it gave him was wonderful. As I arrived home an hour and a half away after our session in Dorking, I received a message that he had lost the entire thing and was on his way to my house, full of fury at his clumsiness, to redo the entire interview before he could decide not to. But, sitting in my studio, we wrote the interview again from memory, and something happened to his anger. As we spoke and wrote, he began to see the extent of his own fear, and that he was denying the reality of his illness. His anger became a vehicle for his illumination, and a great understanding took its place. "I didn't know how much I needed to say all this," he said. "Thank you." His cancer appeared before Mother's, and I wonder if she died first, quickly, so that she did not have to see him die before her. He followed her 6 months later, and I like to think that she was waiting for him, having prepared heaven for him as only she could. Once, many years ago, Mother brought him a burial plot as a Christmas present. "It's the same plot as mine," she told him. "Whoever goes first goes in the bottom." Dominic got on the phone as soon as he could to have his burial plot moved next to hers. Being in the same grave as hers seemed a bit too needy. They lie side by side now in Duncton. It seems it was an inspired Christmas present. Mum and my brother are, with Steve, a part of the exhibition now. Their words and images are there to help us all. "See," all the sitters in the Graceful Death exhibition wanted to say, "see, we are just like you. We are ill, we are dying, but until we die, we are very much alive. Don't be afraid of us. Don't turn away, because you need to take note and begin to talk about your own mortality. Your life is a gift, and being aware of death gives you an appreciation for living." During these years, I began my work as a soul midwife, accompanying those who are facing the end of life at any time from diagnosis to death, offering simple, emotional, spiritual, and holistic support. A soul midwife can be there for 10 minutes, or 10 days, or 10 weeks, whatever is needed. We are non-denominational, non-judgmental, and mostly we are not medics, psychotherapists, counsellors, or social workers. We are just people like you, who visit with, support, and listen to those who may need a friend. We also support families, and we do whatever a good neighbour would do, which is a wonderful thing for anyone who has no one on hand. Some of us provide holistic therapies, some provide gentle, appropriate massage, and some provide just themselves and their intention to serve. The training for a soul midwife is only the very tip of the beginning of any kind of work with the dying. I came away from the course inspired, with wonderful new friends, but realised almost immediately that there was no role, no work, no job ready-made for me. I had to create a place for myself in this area, whatever that meant, starting at the very bottom, volunteering at hospices, learning about the dying process by watching palliative care professionals at work, learning how to listen, learning how to vigil, and putting myself in at the deep end time after time, gaining experience of communicating, listening, being of service, and learning about boundaries. It is very hard work, and it is never over. There is never a point at which we know enough, and each time we meet someone new, it is as if it's the first time all over again. We are so afraid of death. We are so afraid of how a dying person looks, what we will see, and how we should react. We think we cannot mention dying to a dying person, that we must always keep upbeat and not allow them to speak of it. We are so frightened of doing the wrong thing, of saying the wrong thing. But one of my sitters for the Graceful Death exhibition said in our conversations about people who visited her and kept trying to cheer her up by telling her she was looking better and soon she would be up and about, "What can you possibly tell me that would upset me? What could you possibly say that I don't already know? I am dying. It is a fact, and I already know it. This is my reality. Stop pretending." Earlier this afternoon, when Mum had made the journey downstairs from the Chinese bed in her bedroom and was lying down here once again in her bed in the dining room, I put my hands on her head and her chest and did some healing. She was agitated and in great pain. Healing is in my Father's hands. I practice healing because of my father. When I was a little girl, I always wanted him to put his hands on me when I was ill, and I remember him telling me that at his work he was often asked to help people with headaches by holding his hands over that person's head. Dad worked as a radio producer at the BBC at this time, and I loved to think of people stopping their important radio work to find my father and have their headaches cured. It made perfect sense to me. "Your father," said my mother, "has wonderful hands. It is one of the first things I noticed about him." When my own daughter Alexia was little and knew nothing of healing, she would ask me to put my hands on her head and neck and help ease the dreadful headaches that plagued her. It worked for her, and I thought, the healing has come from Dad to me. When I was a student at university in my 20s and my father was visiting me, I suffered a dreadful panic attack. I was always well and healthy, and the panic attack made me think that I was dying. My father rubbed his hands together and held them over my head, not touching me, but holding them there. It felt warm and peaceful, and I felt the panic and fear wind itself up and curl away from me like smoke. When I asked my father what he had done, he said he didn't know. He told me it is something he always known that he can do. Years later, after his dementia had taken hold, I asked him about his hands and his healing. I asked him if he knew how he did it. "I say a prayer," he said, "and I let the healing come." I asked what the prayer was, and he said, "May the Lord heal you from all that harms you and give you his peace, his love, and his joy." Standing this afternoon over my mother as she lay on her bed downstairs, unable to find peace or comfort, I said this prayer of my father's and laid my hands on my mother's chest and head. I wanted to ease her distress, and I wanted to make her pain evaporate from her like smoke, as my father had once done for me. With my hands resting over my mother's heart, my mind was filled with her mother and father, my grandma and granddad, just smiling and being there. My aunt, mother's oldest sister, was with them, and I wondered if I was making it all up. But part of me was moved to think that perhaps things are happening and that mother is moving fast to join them. In my mind, I heard my grandma, my mother's mother, say to me in her lovely Irish accent, "To move over, child. I am here now." And it was so good to hear her say this in my heart that it made me cry.